we really want to make sure everyone is completely clear about the benefits of the Safe System Assessment, or Safe System Audit as it's known in NZ. Follow the process of an SSA within an infrastructure project, and importantly, explain what the difference is between a road safety audit and a Safe System Assessment. And within the New Zealand context, it's a little bit more blurred than other jurisdictions, because there is certainly a significant overlap between what an RSA is and what a Safe System Assessment is, which is why it's got the terminology of Safe System Audit. But yeah, hopefully, by the end of today, you'll have a bit more insight as to when you would apply either of them and the benefits of both of those different frameworks. We'd like to start with this figure here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just chatting about this, just to really contextualize the importance of SSAs and their applicability in the real world. So what this graph is telling us is, along the y-axis, we have fatal and serious injury crashes, so FSI crashes. And the different bars represent different stages of a project. Okay. The green represents serious crashes, and the orangey red is fatal. So, what was completed as part of this project was 35 real projects were analysed that were subject to a Safe System Assessment. So there were 35 real examples of projects where a base case was analysed, and then a Safe System Assessment was analysed, the design was analysed, and then the implementation was also analysed. So they've picked 35 basically case studies and done an evaluation on how they have performed both before an SSA and after. Our first figure here is indicating if those 35 case studies, those 35 sites, if no interventions were implemented, so if there was no project whatsoever, we would expect, around 8,000 FSI crashes to be having over a 20-year period. So quite a significant amount of trauma when you think of it like that, and that's only 35 sites. I should clarify, these projects are relatively large-scale infrastructure projects, things like bypasses, highway duplications or motorway duplications, very large-scale projects. So lots of money and lots of traffic and things like that. So without any project, you can see that is where the highest level of trauma is occurring. The next bar graph that we have is, well, what was originally proposed. So the design team has had a look at existing conditions. They've got an objective to either duplicate the roadway or whatever the outcome is proposed to be. And they start drafting up some plans. So the evaluation then had a look at these plans just based on what is there, and noted just on the design team's work, we are going to see, or expected to see, a reduction in road trauma. So this is before any SSA. What we want to take away from this is it's likely in our current environment, our design work is generally already leaning towards improved safe system outcomes or improved road safety outcomes. That's because we're much more inclined to be installing things like, edge barriers, even mid barriers as well, and just we're much more embedded into thinking about the likelihood of different crash types and how we can manage those risks. So we can see the first stage of this project, we've started to draft some plans and we've already seen an improvement in our level of safety. Then at this stage is when a safe system assessment was undertaken. So this is when an independent audit team came together, reviewed the designs, and recommended particular interventions to further improve that safe system alignment. And you can see from where the design was to where the SSA is recommending, we're seeing an even larger jump. So we're getting a much better safe system performance within these projects. So what that's communicating is SSAs, both at a project level and if you're looking more broadly at programs or multiple projects, they are really key in being able to reduce the level of trauma associated with design works that are currently being proposed. The other key takeaway here is, well, as we all are aware, we're all on a journey towards zero road trauma. So ideally, we'd want to have this bar graphs much closer down to the bottom of the screen. But we're up all the way here, even with the implementation of SSAs. That's a bit interesting. Why would that be the case? That is really an acknowledgement that SSAs, provide these recommendations and think about different crash types and how to mitigate those risks, but acknowledge that there are always going to be other factors at play that can result in road trauma. Things like road user behavior, driving under the influence or fatigue or things like that, whilst you can have infrastructure that can help to reduce those errors from road user behavior, it can still result in a fatal or serious injury. So it hasn't completely eliminated that as a risk altogether. Another example would be, say speeding, for instance. If that was an area that was posted at a lower speed and for whatever reason, a particular road user had decided to travel at higher speeds, resulting in the crash, that's also likely to result in a fatal or serious injury, which would not have been captured within the SSA work. So the SSA, to some extent, is largely focused on the infrastructure side of things. There are notes to take into account the other pillars of the safe system. However, we acknowledge that as a system, we also need to be working on leveraging as much as we can on safe speeds, safer road users, and things like post-crash care and the like. So just a bit of a takeaway there. It's certainly showing a big improvement from just going out there with original designs. However, it's not quite there towards that zero target. The final little interesting part about this graph is you may have noticed things go back up by what was actually installed or adopted by the project. And I might open this up to the group if anyone has any suggestions as to why we may have seen this increase in road trauma or predicted road trauma in the final, invested infrastructure. I'll give you a minute to have a think about that. Why would the trauma levels be increasing after, an SSA team has said, we recommend installing X, Y, and Z, And then after that point, we're still seeing an increased level of trauma. And I'll just check with Kez if I've missed any questions in the chats.
No, there was just a comment about considering environmental conditions from John. Yeah,
absolutely. All right, I'm starting to see some excellent suggestions coming through. First one being, yeah, construction costs. So a safe system assessor, when you are providing your recommendations, is not constrained by budget. So if you recommend things like grade separation or providing pedestrian overpass or build a roundabout to improve safety, those are all valid treatments to be recommending within a safe system assessment report. You do want to make sure that you're providing recommendations that, I suppose, are justifiable or feasible, but it's very common to be able to be, to include these as recommendations, and then the project team considers them unfeasible due to costs. It's a very, very common one. Due to environmental concerns associated with the particular recommendation. There's just a wealth of reasons, a raft of reasons not to implement things, but I don't believe that that should influence your job as a safe system auditor to still be recommending this, because it's our responsibility to really be showing these are the treatments that will reduce the road trauma within this network. So it's really important that we capture that within our recommendations. We can then forward that on to the clients or the project team, and it's for them to determine what is actually reasonable to implement as part of the project. So as noted, a lot of the times, it's quite common, not all the recommendations will be implemented. A few other points, balancing safety objectives with other objectives, absolutely. So that could once again be, you could be thinking about providing separated treatments for cyclists along an entire motorway, for instance, but that would require a lot of land acquisition, or that would require, widening bridges and things like that. So you've got these other conflicting objectives that may impact that as a decision. I like the suggestion from Harriet of change in road user volumes for what was anticipated. I think that's a very, very astute point. Basically, at the time of assessment, you may have assumed that traffic volumes would stay the same, or there'd be some degree of increase, but maybe there was no traffic modeling completed, or perhaps the modeling was based on assumptions that were then found to be not what was apparent on the ground. So you could have that change in volume. And as we know within our safe system assessment metrics, our exposure is intricately linked with our traffic volumes. So if we're getting increases in traffic volumes, we're increasing our exposure score, which would then have an increased crash risk. So a really good point there from Harriet. We might give a prize out there to Harriet Kez. I mean, I like all these answers, but that one was a bit out of left field. I like that. Local context might have required a more specific approach rather than general SSA treatments. That's true. Yep. So something more appropriate for what is there on ground as opposed to just high-level treatments. Other funding priorities, practicality, feasibilities. Users learn how to best use treatments and become more confident to start taking more risks. Wow, that's another very interesting idea as well. So if you did have this beautiful road safety environments, would you then be signaling to road users that this is an opportunity for you to perhaps travel faster above the posted speed limits? Another really good point there. I think they're all very, very valid and very real. There is always going to be a difference between what should be implemented in a perfect world and what is actually achievable. We all have budget constraints, for instance, and that is really indicative of why we're seeing this increase from what is being recommended at the safe system assessment point in time versus what is actually being built. So hopefully that hasn't deterred you too much about the points of the SSAs, because I think a really important thing is if we're doing nothing, you can see there's a massive distance between doing nothing versus what is being proposed after the SSA. And even if we were just to take the original design, well, we can see the implementation of an SSA is seeing reduction in road trauma. So we're very much of the philosophy of we're moving towards that end target of zero road trauma. And as we can see, we are seeing reductions there through the implementation of a safe system audit. So they're still showing really positive signs that they will be able to influence design outcomes. And importantly, they will be able to influence the level of trauma occurring within these projects. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight. For those interested as to how this prediction methodology worked, it was actually through the use of IRAP or KiwiRAP, for those that are familiar, which is basically a framework that uses a methodology to analyze the road safety risks within a given environment. It takes about 72 metrics, things from like lane width, shoulder width, distance to hazards, number of hazards, etc. And then it's spits out a calculation which gives you basically a crash risk score. The scoring is then translated into a star rating, so you can get a road star rated from 1 to 5 stars. Actually, I might go from half a star. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe you can get half a star, but anyway, it's this idea. It's incredibly effective if you are having these conversations with, you know, stakeholders or politicians or the community, but being able to show that, you know, existing conditions is a 3-star road, and with this investment in infrastructure, we'll be able to bring it to a 4.5-star road, for an example. So this IRAP methodology was applied for this evaluation that we're looking at here. So the original base case scenario was analyzed using IRAP. Based on all that information, it could give you a star rating as well as the expected number of crashes to be occurring there. So it's also got that predictive function as well. IRAP was then analyzed using the original design, if the SSA recommendations were to be implemented, and then what was finally recorded. So that's why it's actually a predicted state. This work could be further evaluated to show, well, what is the actual trauma that has occurred, because this is about 3 or 4 years old now. So there could be further work done to I suppose, double check, is this the kind of figures that we're looking at, or is it higher or lower? But that's the way that they were managed to forecast the expected trauma in each of those state cases. All right, our key benefits when looking at safe system assessments. Basically providing a way to determine how well a project aligns with safe system principles. I think that's the best description of it. It can be easy to, get stuck into different phrases about, improving road safety performance or things like that, but always tying it back to our safe system principles is a really important way to define the SSA. It's a way that we actually compare, a project versus the existing conditions, and also existing conditions versus lots of different project options. So you could be looking at a particular intersection, and maybe you're thinking about signalizing it, and maybe you're thinking about producing a roundabout. So a safe system assessment would be an excellent tool in that instance to gauge safe system alignment within all of those cases. So against the existing case, against the signalized case, against the roundabout case. So it's a really, really good tool when you are looking at different options and trying to gauge what is a preferred option in terms of road safety. An SSA is also critical in providing the project team information or interventions to be able to move the project towards that end state of zero road trauma. So that idea of recommending primary treatments that virtually eliminate the risk of fatal and serious injuries. The reason I think that's so important is because it's possible that, designers that were originally drafting plans based on, the initial brief, they may not have come across terms such as raised intersections or compact roundabouts. They may not have considered those those interventions as part of the brief. And so our role as safe system assessors is to really try and influence the design team and acknowledge the importance of providing primary treatments, because they just offer such a improved level of road safety performance. So it's about sharing that information and really, just trying to make it as important as possible, our recommendations. A method to assist planners, designers, project managers to move the safe system approach from theory into practice. So no longer are we just talking about compact roundabouts, for instance. We want to see them actually being installed. Same with raised intersections and the like. It's no longer just a theoretical thing that you can see other jurisdictions doing or, written up in a research paper somewhere. We want to really start embedding them into our networks. And a sound basis for future planning and the design of road infrastructure. I'll have a little bit of a chat now about the process and I suppose where we kind of see the SSAs fitting into the design life of a project. So this slide here takes us into where it's kind of most important to have your SSAs and RSAs being completed. The kind of wider the arrow indicating level of importance. And you'll see the SSA, they're right at the top. Concept, draft level. So functional designs, preliminary designs, concept plans, even where you've got nothing really to gauge your, no drawings really produced yet, and SSA is a really good tool to be using. If you've got, say, just a line on the map which shows connection between two towns and that's all you've got to work with, an SSA could be used in that instance. And the reason for this is because SSAs are much more focused on implementing, I suppose, quite broader project changes. So things changing with the configuration of the design. So it is, a much larger ability to influence the then other aspects of the design, such as detailed build. Once you're already doing detailed designs, you're somewhat already committed to, we are building this signalized intersection, for instance. However, if you're coming in at a concept draft preliminary plan and you're saying, well, maybe it shouldn't be a signalized, maybe it should be a raised intersection with signalized, you've got a much better chance of influencing that outcome at the early design stages. So that's really when the SSAs are most imperative, or most have the biggest chance of influencing. Yes.
Yeah, Max, Anatol's just asking, why do the New Zealand guidelines indicate an SSA should be done pre-opening or post-construction?
Yeah, good point. So the safe system audit in New Zealand is a little bit different to how other jurisdictions are running with these things, which Waikatahi have noted within their guidance. So they've got a slight departure from the Austroads safe system assessment guidelines. And the safe system audit is very much a blend of both of these things. So it's saying within the NZTA guidance there that the safe system audits may be completed at these earlier levels, because that's really when the road safety audit component of things will kick into gear. That's when that aspect of the framework will be more important. So yeah, the NZ is slightly different. So this graph is, sorry, this figure is showing them as two separate entities, whereas in NZ they're much more combined. But I might run through the template, which can kind of illustrate that a little bit more, just so it's a little bit clearer for everyone. Good question, mate. Thanks, Anton. Conversely, our road safety audits generally more critical at more progressed stages. Road safety audits in particular at a detailed stage, because they do really focus on a lot of the, you know, they look at a lot of those detailed plans and look at the cross sections and the longitudinal plans and check for, you know, appropriate crossfalls and things like that. Got a real ability to check on those safety concerns, but you wouldn't expect a road safety audit to necessarily be recommending quite, you know, things that would broadly change the project scope, or things that would broadly change the project configuration. Really, really common to have, you know, RSAs in post-construction, as well as temporary traffic management, things like that as well. But just gives you a bit of an insight. If you were to do a safe system assessment, so not looking at the broad safe system audit term, but just the SSA, where you've got the matrix and things like that, you're doing the scoring. So we'll just call that the SSA. At the earliest stages of a project, that's really when they have the most benefit. Touch on a little bit more information as to how those two terms do differ. So acknowledge that NZ have come up with a blended approach, but in terms of the scope, both of them certainly identify issues that impact the likelihood of crashes. The SSA does a much better job of relating that back to the severity of crashes. And in terms of exposure, a road safety audit doesn't really independently look at exposure. A road safety audit would just be looking at the likelihood and the severity. So the exposure is coupled into the likelihood category, whereas within an SSA, it's its own separate metric. So that's one of the differences there with RSA and SSA. Both of them provide recommendations to improve road safety outcomes. Both of them are looking broadly across all road users within the area. This one's an interesting one. An RSA actually looks at all crash types and crash severities. It even considers things like property damage. So you could be having lots and lots of fender benders or lots of, minor crashes, say within a car park, for instance. And while the severity of those crashes are negligible, people walk away from that. It's just property damage to the vehicles. If they were to be occurring often, a road safety audit may categorize that as a high risk or an extreme risk. That's not the case with the Safe System Assessment, because what we are focused on within an SSA is the prevention and reduction in fatal and serious injuries. So the focus of an SSA is purely on those FSI crashes. That's another, I suppose, departure between the two. That's just what I mentioned there below, focuses on all crash types. The SSA focuses on all the other pillars of the safe system, such as safer vehicles, safer people, looks at the impact on maintenance and post-crash care, makes recommendations to redesign the project if required. So that's where I'm saying the SSA has a lot more ability to influence about the project's configuration, because it can be quite broad. It can say, we don't recommend installing this treatment. We recommend installing X, Y, and Z. So it's got a much more influential aspect in that respect. And the final one that I really wanted to mention is encourages innovative design. And SSA is excellent as that. As I've been talking about before, an SSA can really showcase to designers who may not have heard particular treatments before or may not be aware of, what would be considered best practice within the road safety realm. It can spruik those and say, this is what we should be installing. A road safety audit tends to be a little bit more constrained, and it tends to be more focused on the practicalities of installation and looking at installing based on other common projects within the area. So it's much more focused on hitting that norm, the status quo, and not as innovative. So another big tick there for the SSA. Both of them are incredibly powerful tools. I'm not trying to, entice one over the other. I think they're both very important. And considering NZ kind of packages them both up quite nicely, it's pretty exciting to see the outcomes of that decision. So I should just clarify that was in the New Zealand Safe System Audit Guidelines was released, I believe, like October or maybe November last year. So it's still building up its case within jurisdictions and within the real world. So we'll start to see more and more application of how the safe system audits are taking place and their effectiveness. But it's pretty exciting the way that NZ have coupled those together. Yes.
Yeah, just a couple of questions about how does an SSA investigate safer vehicles and people?
Yeah, okay. So within, and I will show the report template for your safe system audits. There are some prompts, which are basically questions for the project team to answer or the independent audit team, which will be questions directly relating to those pillars. So it'll be, how would this environment affect the ability for, autonomous vehicles to be able to run, for instance? Or how would the road environment influence or encourage behavior which may increase the crash risk? So like hooning behavior or things like that. So if you had a really wide intersection or just a really straight section of road and there's lots and there's no hazards in place because it's all got barrier on other sides, you could say that may influence the risk of hooning behavior and things like that. So that there are prompts within the SSA to help contextualize those other safe system pillars. In terms of making recommendations to mitigate those risks, it's really challenging as safe system auditors because we're very much focused on infrastructure. I suppose that's kind of our bread and butter. So at this stage, we're generally just recognizing them and acknowledging it within safe system assessment reports. Every now and then you could have a recommendation. So for instance, investigating post-crash care, if the site that you're analyzing is in a regional rural environment, it could be up on a mountain, for instance, and there's a prompt within the safe system audit report that would be like, how accessible is this area? If an event were to occur, could emergency services attend? And that would be an opportunity for the audit team to say, it's incredibly remote. It's incredibly unlikely that emergency services could attend within a reasonable time frame. And so you could then recommend, well, perhaps we need to be installing things like helipads for medical helicopters to be able to land safely, you know, in this area to be able to attend to emergency sites. And I know that may sound far out, but it has occurred within safe system assessments to recommend those things, and the project team to then, you know, take that on as a genuine consideration. So that's basically how those pillars are currently thought of. They're described within the report, and every now and then you'll get an opportunity to link that to a recommendation. But it can be difficult, I'll be honest. We'll hop into the SSA process now. This terminology of a full or a rapid SSA, not really used within New Zealand, so I'm not going to get too hung up about that. It's just, yeah, I've got a slide here that will show you the difference. But basically, safe system audits within New Zealand appear to be one level. So you don't really need to worry about that. But basically at this stage, what we're talking about is the clients determining, you know, what is the project and what is to be audited, and then selecting the SSA team. For New Zealand, within the frequently asked questions, which I might also share within the Safe System Audit Guidelines, is this idea that the SSA team, yeah, should be independent. So it shouldn't be the project team itself. The reason for that is you want to make sure that you've got fresh eyes on the design, and also involving people that may not be aware of site constraints, may not be aware of budget constraints and things like that. So they can come at and look at this design and solely focus on the safe system alignment with the project. Okay? So they can step away from all those other factors that may influence the project. When it's referring to clients, that is generally the road controlling authority. Okay? Then a really good idea to sit down in a commencement meeting. Generally, you couple these two items together where you talk about the project context. Really, really good opportunity within this commencement meeting to talk through those prompts that I was talking about. So you can talk about, well, what road users are expected within this area. You know, how likely is it for emergency services to be able to attend an event? If enforcement was required within this environment, how could that be achieved? Things like that. This is a really good opportunity when you're together with the project team to talk through those prompts and record responses. Then there's an inspection of the site. Can be a little bit difficult if you are proposing a greenfield site, which is going through paddocks and the like, but generally sites can be, driven through. You can capture dash cam footage, or you can, where safe to do so, stop and take photos of the road and roadside environment. Completing the SSA matrix is completed by the team that has been nominated. So once again, that independence is really critical. Considering other elements of the SAFE system, so that's where those prompt questions come in. Identifying treatments to improve SAFE system alignment. So that's where the recommendations within the report fit in. Write the SSA report. And NZTA, Waka Kotahi have produced this template, which I'm referring to. Perfect way to get started, because you've got all the relevant headings there, you know what you should be filling in. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that this is a formal document. It's not just, here's some matrix scores and, this is looking better than this one. It's a formal document that is meant to be articulating the safety risks associated with existing conditions and design options. And it is, it should be relatively homogeneous across different jurisdictions. You should be seeing reports that look, familiar and common. Here's a great one. This one is the client responsibility. Responding to the suggested recommendations, okay? What we don't want to see is the SAFE system audit reports being completed, because that is a requirement, and then they get filed away somewhere or tucked away in a drawer, and that's it. It is the client's responsibility to respond to the recommendations that are being provided by the SSA team. I think it's just so critical, this aspect, because we really need to acknowledge that the project team, or the road controlling authority, they really have ability to influence the outcome for trauma within their projects. And this is one way to achieve that accountability is, okay, if you're not proposing to implement the recommended treatments, why not? So really trying to make that clear. And it's not so much to be like, you have to do whatever the SAFE system audit report says. It's not trying to be like that. It's more acknowledging that, we've put this report together and we're saying these are the best things to do. We need to capture, well, why can't we do that in this particular instance? And there may be very valid reasons not to do what is being recommended. So I think that's a really critical step in this process. Where suggestions have been accepted by the team, then obviously amending those in the design and eventually constructing, those preferred recommended treatments. Yes, any questions that have come through?
Yeah, I think on that note, Anatole mentioned if it was a private developer, should they decide what is taken on board? So I don't know if we've covered that, whether it would be different if it was a private developer.
Yeah, see, private can get a little bit tricky. So if you were to put your shoes in the private developer space, if they were to say, I'm building this road network, why do I need a SAFE system audit done, etc. And then you respond as a road controlling authority to say that this is what is required within infrastructure projects or things like that. The first thing they'll probably ask you is like, well, have you done one for your duplication, or have you done one for the signalized intersection that's getting done and things like that? So the first thing I'd mention there is if you can lead the way within this space and ensure that your projects are achieving this before requiring private developers to be achieving this as well. That's critical to show that you are leading within this space and it's not just a requirement for them. The other thing I'll mention is presumably the private developers would be handing over these networks to the road controlling authority, which means at the end of the day, whatever is built within that area would be, you know, the RCA's responsibility, which means they have a very vested interest as to what is designed within those precincts. Maybe it's more relevant where the precincts actually connect with, you know, connect within the new development itself, but depending on the project, who actually has responsibility of the network within the facility as well. But yeah, I think the best way to achieve these outcomes is to show your property developers that you are, you know, you are also singing to the same hymn sheet, so to speak. You are also developing your project with safe system audit guidelines and producing these type of reports.
Yeah, Max, just while we're on that, there's a couple of questions from Luke which we could go back to, but John's saying further to Anatol's comment, in that case, should the local council be provided with a copy, given they will ultimately be taking over the new road?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
I would almost say that they are the end client in this process.
That's great. So Luke's questions were regarding the SSA team. Would it be still good to have certain types of road users on the SSA team, people with no formal knowledge of safe system?
Wonderful, wonderful question there. Let's give out a prize there, Kez. Yes, I think it's really important. Everyone within this webinar and that have gone through this course, I would suggest you are all now becoming the leaders within the safe system audit space. And it should be people that have completed this formal training that are spearheading the SSAs within these projects and, you know, defining things like what's the scope of the project, what are we assessing, what are the design, you know, recommendations that we could be looking into. That's everyone within this environment today. I don't believe that we need to be shutting the door on anyone else that hasn't necessarily done this training as part of the SSA team. The reason I say that is because it can be really, really useful to get a lot of different experiences involved within these projects. A recent example, I might go off a little off topic here, but kind of a relevant thing that's popped up within Melbourne is there is this wonderful bicycle overhead structure that's being constructed within Melbourne called a Valoway. Actually, it's similar to what is in Auckland. I think it's Auckland. That beautiful pink. I think it's Auckland. Could be Christchurch. No, I think it's Auckland. Anyway, just this beautiful overhead structure for cyclists. You know? And went through all these design checks. Yeah, we're going to make it 4 meters wide. It's going to be really wonderful. It's going to make sure that cyclists don't have to interact with general traffic. They're completely grade separated. Tick, 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 tick. Lots of wonderful safe system alignment with that process. What was missed out, which has come into the paper recently, is the acknowledgement of personal safety, particularly for women, because you've basically provided this one long tunnel, even though it's not a tunnel, but you know, one long section, which is inescapable. So you can't readily leave the area should there be something that is uncomfortable or something that is, you know, something that you want to get away from, basically. So it's tying into that question of, you know, who should be involved in the SSA team. That's a really good example of where getting different experiences, different people with different backgrounds involved in the design so they can cast their own lens as to how it would feel interacting within that space. There's also another reporting framework that is being developed, called a gender impact assessment, which is probably more relevant for that example that I used. But yeah, acknowledging how different walks of life would experience the particular infrastructure treatment that you're proposing. So in a very long-winded way, I've hopefully clarified that, yes, if you're able to get people with different backgrounds involved within the SSA team, you probably don't want them writing the report because they may not understand the technical jargon, or, you know, what is the speed that we're looking at for vulnerable road users when a crash occurs. That's still very much within the group that we've got here today, because you're all leading this work. But to have them as part of reviewing the design and airing their concerns, I think is a really wonderful step in the process.
Yeah, Luke also mentioned about the commencement meeting. Does this influence the SSA team if they've been told by the client or designer they have XY constraints?
Good question. So if you're told by the client, say, this is my budget, this is all I can do, you know, write me a safe system audit guidelines that fits that. Ooh, yeah, right. As an auditor, I would still be putting down the recommendations that I believe would be the best fit for that environment. You could add a caveat to say we acknowledge that the project team has XYZ constraints. However, as a trained safe system auditor, I recognize the safety benefits are immense with this recommendation that I'm proposing, full stop. So I think if you can capture still your stance on the issue, like this is seriously such a good thing to be implementing, we should be doing this, with a little caveat to say we acknowledge that the project team has XYZ constraints. And then it's over to the project team to respond anyway. So they could just say, yes, we don't have the ability to install whatever you're recommending. Great question. Let's give out a prize to that one. I missed the name there, Kez, but that was a great question.
Yeah, that was from Luke.
Luke.
So Anatole said the road controlling authority may not accept vesting of the new roads that are not fit for purpose. So shouldn't they make the decisions and not the client?
Yeah, okay. So that's kind of back to the comment there of the LGA may become the client in that instance. So yeah, just making sure that the client is defined early on at the scope, and generally it is the road controlling authority, like who will ultimately take ownership and responsibility of that network.
So John was asking then, could there be a scenario where a new road meets council standards but doesn't incorporate SSA principles?
Absolutely, yes. That could definitely happen, which is why it's important for the safe system audit team to have someone within this group, someone that's done the training and someone that knows safe system principles and what infrastructure is going to improve the level of safety. Yep. Because otherwise we'll just keep building, you know, what's already out there within the council network, and it may not necessarily align with our principles that we've been discussing.
That's great. So many comments coming in here, Max. I think if anyone would like to let me know if I've missed a question, but it looks like mostly comments there around this. It's great.
Awesome. Thanks for keeping this together. We've got, I could either pause here, Kez, or keep going through and give everyone an early finish. Should we take 5 minutes just to have a little stretch and get a cup of tea? What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds great. And if anyone just puts their hand, lets me know if there's anything I've missed there in those comments, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'll come back. Mine says 8:57, so I'll just say 9:02. We'll start the presentation again. Just stuck back into things. I do have a question that was just to the hosts and panelists. Comment on whether, if a private developer retains control of the road, how would that influence the projects? Because, you know, they are essentially the clients in that respect because they've got the ultimate responsibility. Much more difficult to influence. unless you've got a policy within your organization that stipulates all developments, regardless of who has control at the end of the day, is required to undergo the SSA, I think you'd have a very difficult time trying to influence property developers in those instances. So the ones I was talking about before is when ownership does get passed back to your LGA, but if it was to be held on by the developer, then you can certainly try to influence them by suggesting that this is what's considered best practice. But at the end of the day, because it's their, their network and their responsibility, they're probably going to do what works best for their best interest. Okay. There is, this is obviously Victoria, Australia, but for those that are interested, within the Safe System Engineering website of VicRoads, there is a recommended list of safe system assessors. This is the only register that's out there, so New Zealand doesn't have one, unfortunately, but there's nothing to say New Zealand's people are not able to apply to this. You just need to demonstrate an example where you've been involved in an SSA. You provide that as an example. There's some questions associated with your understanding of the safe system principles and things like that. And then you can get on this list. So for those that are interested in, I suppose, seeing some kind of formal recognition by a government's authority that you do have expertise within this subject matter, recommend you giving that a go once you've completed your first SSA. And I should clarify that the SSA that you are doing as part of the assignment for this module, it wouldn't actually be counted because it's not a full report, and also because we're giving you the design and we're giving you hypotheticals and stuff like that, it's not considered, a full report. So once you've actually completed one in the real world, then you'd be able to apply for this, and this is just the list that you'd get onto. And it just gets updated periodically with more and more names. There's me right at the bottom. Yeah, so if you are interested in that, feel free to click through that and get involved. This one's only for Victoria and South Australia, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but that's where I was talking about the rapid and the full. Basically, we'd do a rapid if the project expected cost was, 2 million. Above that, we're probably looking at full rapid SSA, and the difference between the two are just like site inspections you may not necessarily do within the rapid. You may not necessarily do all the other prompts associated with, the other safe system pillars within a rapid SSA. So it's just focused on the infrastructure, but not going to spend a lot of time on that because I recognize people here may not benefit from that. I'm going to chat now about different safe system road environments. So we've already done some work in this in previous modules. The reason that we've included it here as well is because the SSA assignment that you've got is one example of one road environment. But as we know, there's a raft of different options where an SSA could be conducted. So we just want to make sure that you feel comfortable in acknowledging what are the safety risks within these different environments, just a selection. Things that you'd be looking out for if you were to be conducting an SSA within these environments. So an opportunity again to jot down in the chat different ideas, so different risk factors, and we'll do that little activity again where pop down whether those particular factors would influence exposure, likelihood, or severity, just to make sure that we're really cemented that idea within everyone's head. We'll get started with the first one being a residential environment. So if you were to assess this existing conditions, what types of things do you think would influence your exposure, likelihood, and severity within this environment? Give you a moment to pop that down. While I blow my nose. Wonderful to see all these factors coming in and being correctly categorized as well. So excellent to see such a switched on group. Seeing a lot of, traffic volumes, which is certainly exposure when we're looking at the volumes of units of particular road users. Also the mention of the school that's nearby, and that would also increase the exposure because you've got presumably more vulnerable road users, children, for instance, traveling within that area. You could also classify that as a factor influencing severity, because if you had lots of school children within a particular area, if a crash were to occur, it's likely to be more severe, because if we have more young people involved in it, as we know, their bodies are unable to withstand the same forces as adults. You could also say that influences severity, but I certainly agree with exposure there as well. Speed, awesome to see. The alignments, presence of parked cars may reduce speed, thus severity, but increase the likelihood of ped crashes. That's right. Yeah, you can certainly have things influencing both for and against in different columns. So I agree with that kind of philosophy. In terms of treatments, you're welcome to write them down, but just quickly, we could look at reducing speeds within this environment. We could look at creating a cul-de-sac, so it's no longer a through environment. It's just a local network that terminates at that intersection. Local area traffic management treatments, slow points and speed humps and things like that, just to really emphasize the lower speeds. Just a few treatments that you could look if you're doing an SSA within this environment. I won't do the same exercise for this one. I might just run through some of my thoughts within this area. So this is a shared zone from memory. Yeah, it is. This is in Bondi Junction. And as you can see, highly pedestrianized area where pedestrians do have right of way. But if you look at the road environment, it still looks like a road. You can see that there's line marking there, and just the width of these carriageways. It's not a super well constructed shared zone. The kind of design philosophy or principle within a shared zone is you should make it not look like a road, just to make vehicles feel like they shouldn't be there, kind of thing. Gives pedestrians a more attractive area as well. So things like tactical urbanism would be perfect within this space. You can see they've implemented these bollards to deter vehicles entering the footpath. But yeah, there's probably a few things that could be improved within this particular example to make it more aligned with safe system principles. Mixed use arterials, and Any guesses where this example is from? We'll do the same exercise for exposure, likelihood, and severity. And Parzan there is correct. It is in Hamilton. And coincidentally, Frankton there, I live in Frankston in Victoria, in Melbourne. So one letter away, but just something I noticed. What about this environment? What could we do to influence exposure, likelihood, or severity, or what existing features influence exposure, likelihood, severity? So feel free to jot down some points within the chat. Absolutely. All right. I might just carry on and acknowledge that people are still going through that. But this exercise is really, as I mentioned, just showing you how an SSA could be applied in multiple different settings. It's not just for one particular environment, and really highlighting what you should be looking out for if you were an auditor in these particular examples. So great to see again, volumes, traffic volumes, always exposure, absolutely. The pedestrian refuge, I'd actually put that in a likelihood category as opposed to exposure, because your exposure has just got to do with the numbers, whereas making it more or less likely providing a pedestrian refuge. You do have, signalized crossing point there, but obviously maybe that's not where the demand is. Maybe the demand is over here. So how to manage that as a risk. Yeah, great to see the acknowledgement of the bus stop. And yeah, if you've got the bus stop there, then presumably you've got more people within that area. And also whenever you've got bus stops, you've got generally people wanting to cross on both sides of the carriageway, maybe to get to the bus stop on the opposite side of the road. So that's another really good feature to note. I'll move on to the next one. I might just go through these next ones, but feel free to just jot down any ideas that you may have yourself. But in these low volume rural roads, a lot of these roads that we just have, thousands of kilometers of, how do we manage these? Well, if we were to go full safe system infrastructure, just focus on the infrastructure, what we would want to be doing is, getting our sealed shoulders, getting an edge barrier, even putting a barrier in the middle as well, just to be able to reduce the risk of head-on crashes. Creating 2+1 arrangements, where you've got overtaking on one side of the carriageway and then overtaking on the other side. To be able to achieve that is phenomenally expensive, particularly considering the sheer volume of roads that look like this. So what else could we do within this space? Well, this is really an opportunity for us to acknowledge that speeds within these environments are really not at all aligned well with what we can actually survive if we were to run off the road. So trying to champion speed within these particular contexts would be likely the most palatable or the most achievable. And I say that with an asterisk because I know the challenges associated when you are trying to change speeds within these environments. A good tip if you were looking at doing something like that. Actually, I've got two anecdotes I could share. So there was, and Kez, you might have to interrupt if Ken has shared this, because I can't remember if he's already talked about this, but the Swedish speed lottery. Does that sound familiar?
No, I don't think we've heard it.
Cool. All right. Well, then I get to share it. That's great. The Swedes, about 10 years ago now, they set up some speed cameras and obviously snapped all the violators that were traveling above the speed, and there's a $400 fine or whatever associated with that. But it also snapped all the number plates of people going under the speed limit and created a lottery system. So if you were going under the speed, you immediately got a ticket into the lottery and you got to win. So that money that was set aside from the fine then got put into this bucket where prizes were then issued to people that were going under the speed. So it's just a pretty clever way of trying to make it a bit of a fun thing, you know, trying to make going at the speed or below the speed a fun thing, and you'd actually be rewarded for that. I should acknowledge that, you know, it was just a trial and it's not something that they've, you know, implemented long term, and they haven't shifted it to different sites or anything like that. But I thought that was quite an innovative thing to be doing. So well done to the Swedes. The other thing I was going to mention within these areas, which perhaps could be more achievable, would be maybe even like part-time reductions in speed. So if you acknowledge that we're really worried about head-on crashes in these environments, and we acknowledge that, you know, traditionally the bulk of our traffic are moving between the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. window, could we implement a reduced speed just for that period of time? And if you are able to achieve a part-time speed reduction, as in the community is supportive and the sentiment is well received, then that gives you a further opportunity to then say, well, the risk also exists outside of those times, so perhaps we just drop the speed limit permanently. So it could be a step change like that. Just another way that you could approach speed. Speed's, yeah, just a very, very contentious issue, as I'm sure you're all incredibly aware of. High volume rural roads. So these are probably the more likely ones to expect infrastructure upgrades. So as I mentioned before, edge barrier in the middle as well. Yeah, you could look at audio tactile line marking. You could look at raised reflective pavement markers, all those types of things to reduce the risk of crashes. Thinking about intersections now, well, if you've got a high volume road, which I'm going to say is this north-south one, and a low volume road, how do we manage risk at these locations? And New Zealand's have done awesome work within the REORS space. Basically, if there was a vehicle approaching on the minor leg, then the major leg slows down. There's a vehicle activated sign. So instead of going 100, you're going 70 now, or whatever it is. Just acknowledging that there is a crash risk at this location. So let's try and bring speeds down. That's a really, really cool treatment, and something that can be certainly recommended as part of safe system audits. High volume arterial roads, generally quite constrained sites, very difficult to be able to, you know, build bigger things like roundabouts and the like. Something that catches my eye immediately is having an on-road bicycle lane in an environment which I believe is 80 kilometers per hour. That does not align very well with safe system principles. So that's something that we could be looking to recommend as part of a safe system audit, trying to bring that off-road or trying to provide protection for cyclists. Difficult environments though. You can even see we've got pedestrian fencing, which we've talked about before, trying to, you know, not encourage pedestrians crossing over this busy road environments. But acknowledge that can only get you so far. And if as we see here, we've got a bus stop on that side, a bus stop on that side. It's likely people will want to be crossing within this area. So what could be recommending, you know, as auditors, you could be saying we need to move bus stops closer to the signalized crossing point. So at least pedestrians have those facilities to cross with phasing. Just things to be watching out for. I've only got a few more slides and then I'll show you the template that I've been talking about. Major freeways. Yeah, this is another example of where your prompts into post-crash care may be particularly relevant. Thinking about if there was an accident to occur here, how could emergency services attend the site, particularly where there's no shoulder for an ambulance to be driving on to be able to access the site. So that should be ringing alarm bells for auditors. That can definitely impact the level of severity that can occur if they're unable to attend the site in a timely manner. This is how major rural highways have been constructed in decades past, having this very, very wide median in the middle, and just assuming that's enough to reduce the risk of head-on crash. We know now that it doesn't. Instead, it'd be much more likely to see this narrowed up and just a central median barrier to be installed. So there's good outcomes there. That's an example of where you actually may get cost savings. This type of footprint obviously requires a lot of earthworks, a lot of environmental impacts. You may be cutting down trees and the like. Whereas if you're able to make that narrower, less construction costs. So it's just an example where an SSA may be able to save the project money. I think I've got one more slide here. Yeah, rural intersections. Little bit difficult to see here. This is a very busy, you know, rural highway, which would connect major townships and the like. And how do we manage intersections that are not grade separated? You know, they don't have those acceleration lanes and things like that, so it could just be a minor one. First thing you could do, I'll try and draw this out. I'm not overly confident this will work, but let's give it a go. So I've got my local road kind of running left, right there, and then this major highway, and that's like the median in the middle there. The first thing that we could be recommending as auditors is let's not enable straight through crossing here, because a vehicle that has to prop and wait, you know, give way to everyone there and then stop in the middle and then give way to everyone there. Just the speeds that we're talking here, it's really not an appropriate treatment to be recommending. So you've got to then think about, well, then how can we manage that? Because presumably there is a desire for vehicles to maintain that movement. Just get rid of all those. So one way that we could look to still maintain that is provide an acceleration lane. So you'd be able to get up to speed the vehicles that are exiting there. So they're turning left out of there. At some point further down, they'd have the ability to cross over to the lanes and then perform a U-turn, and similarly decelerate and enter this road here. So although it may be more circuitous for the driver, which it certainly would be, what you've done is you're instead trying to bring vehicle speeds to relatively the same level where there is the conflict. So you've got this acceleration to make sure if there was a crash occurring, at that conflict point, speeds are relatively the same. And also the angle of the crash is much more forgiving because you'd have an angle that looks more like that. And so it's referred to as the change of velocity, the change of speed there is much decreased as opposed to if you were trying to cross over in that direction and then someone at 100 kilometers an hour was coming up that way. So another treatment you could possibly recommend within these types of environment. And yeah, I know the risk there is still at the U-turn. I should have probably mentioned that you could also provide that U-turn an acceleration lane as well before they are able to merge in with general traffic there as well. Once again, focusing on that change of V. That's all I had for the presentation. So I'll pause there and just check in with Kez to make sure I haven't missed anything.
Irene just mentioned, would an intersection speed zone sign be a good solution for this rural intersection?
An intersection speed zone sign. So we're talking about like the REORs there. I would agree with that. I think that could be, yeah. I think that could work. Yep.
Yeah,
so just managing speed on approach to the conflict point.
Yeah, sorry, Max, that's the only question outstanding.
Fabulous. Okay. So, as you can still see that I've just brought up a web page there. Kez, can you see that?
Yes, I've got that.
Excellent. Okay. So this is the Safe System Audit Guidelines document that I've been referring to in today's module. At the bottom of it, it was published in October 2022, so it's still relatively fresh. At the bottom of it, you can download the guidelines. You can download the template. What's really exciting is there's an exemption form. So I'll touch on that in a second, but this is the template that I've been referring to throughout today. So it gives you all the headings that are required to be able to complete your Safe System audit. So there's no kind of guesswork as to what you should be including. It's got all the Safe System audit procedure, things that we've been talking about today. The Safe System Assessment Matrix is in there. All the prompts that I've been talking about is in there as well. So I'm just going to skip through this because it's what we have been talking about. Here's just an example of one of the prompts. What are the road users' presence? That's another example. What is the vehicle composition? Another example of the prompt. That's the SSA components that we've been talking about, where you've got the matrix and the scoring system. This safety concern, this is more the road safety audit component. So that's what I'm saying was previously separated. You had these two different documents. Within this template, they're put together. So there's also, it's just referred to as safety concerns, but you've got the ability to select a probability, select a risk rating, and you'll be able to reduce a overall crash risk for this particular. And the way that is defined is earlier on in the document in figure 1. So this diagram here will say, I can't remember which two values I've selected, but say if it was likely and serious, then it's considered a serious crash safety concern. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense why I was saying that, you know, previously they were two separate documents, but now they've kind of brought both methodologies into the one. The other really cool thing is this Safe System Audit Exemption Form. And this is where a road controlling authority would need to say exactly why they don't believe a safe system audit is required on their projects. This is amazing accountability. I can't say I've seen this at all in other jurisdictions, but basically someone within the RSA would need to sign off and say, you know, I consider that the project will not have an adverse effect on safety of road users, which is an incredible statement to make. I wouldn't be signing that anytime soon, personally. I think any project anywhere could have an impact on the safety, an adverse impact, just depending on how you look at it. So it's interesting to see how many exemption forms will actually be submitted to RCAs. I imagine people would be quite hesitant to sign off on that. But there you go. What a process. Go NZ. The last one that I wanted to just bring to your attention as well. So I mentioned in module 3 that we've developed those safe system assessment fact sheets, which are like common questions that come up as part of doing a safe system assessment. There's also this one, safe system assessment audit guidelines that NZ have released only earlier this year in January, but stipulating what is the process, you know, just basically the frequently asked questions, and, you know, acknowledging that Waka Kotahi has not used the Austroads Road Safety Audit Guide. They have created their own blends. So it acknowledges that within this. And this is basically when it's stipulating when the safe system audit shall be completed. So it says Waka Kotahi requires that these audit procedures be applied to any improvement or renewal project or activity that involves funding assistance from the National Land Transport Fund. So to me, that is not at all dependent on the size of the project. So if it was a pram ramp that was being installed, that could cost $20,000. If it was funded by the National Land Transport Funds, a safe system audit would be required. My interpretation of reading this to be completed for that project. So really interesting approach that they've gone for. And I'm very, very excited to see how this is rolled out within NZ. It should be noted that they are running sessions within the middle of 2023 just to check on the practitioner's experience of using this, but feedback is also welcome at any time. So encourage you, if you are involved in these projects and you notice any peculiarities or anything where the process could perhaps be homogenized or made easier, then just passing on that feedback to traffic and safety. The final thing I was going to mention was just completion of this course. So yours will look a little bit different to the screen that I'm showing. Sorry, Kez, did you want to jump in?
Oh, just about that, I think we should address, why does section 5 of the template omit a recommendation section?
Provide additional discussions, recommendations of specific concerns. So the design team response, the safety engineer. So this is where you have an opportunity to pop in your recommendations. That's where I'd be putting it in there. Yeah, it looks a little bit different depending on different jurisdictions. So you could also pop some in here as well. But under each risk that you identify as part of the project, you can also just pop in a risk recommendation as well. Yeah. Good question. I was going to mention completion of this course now. So on the LMS, once you have completed all your modules, you've completed your safe system assessment assignments. There's a quiz after today as well. You scroll right down to the bottom where there's feedback and certificates. We require the course feedback to be completed. So that's also one of the other things that must be done in order to achieve your certificate. The reason is, like, we really want to make sure that we are providing the best courses possible, and we really encourage honest feedback. So anything that you found perhaps challenging or not articulated well, we want to know that, because we want to make sure that we're continually improving these courses. Shouldn't take long though. It's not an onerous feedback form or anything like that. Once you've done everything, and all of the coursework has been marked, and you've achieved those minimum benchmark requirements, you'll have a link here for the SSA certificate. You'll be able to click on that, and that will be your certificate. We will also send you a hard copy certificate, just so you've got that piece of paper. And any prizes that you may have won as well, we'll send that with the certificate as well. So hopefully that's clear. All the coursework needs to be completed, needs to have been marked. The course feedback needs to have been completed. And then once that's done, you should have that link and you should get that letter in the mail from Triple S. That's all the content I was going to go through for today. As I mentioned, I did want to give extra time just to get you working on the quizzes and the Safe System Assessment report. Really encourage you to continue to reach out if you do have any questions about any of the content. Also, keep in touch with all your peers that have joined this module as well and joined this experience, because it's likely you'll be working alongside each other, implementing these safe system audits. You know, it's really the next generation for New Zealand. So it's incredibly exciting to see. You've been a wonderful group. It's very appreciative when we get lots of chats and questions coming through, and yeah, thanks for taking the time. And Kez, anything you'd like to finish with?
No, just in case we've missed anything there in the comments, just contact the training team through the inbox and someone will get back with an answer. That's great.
Excellent. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and stay safe. And yes, look forward to seeing the assignments coming through. Thanks, Kez. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.